Dr. Greitens, you mentioned in your statement the June launch of joint patrols and information sharing between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Increased regional cooperation has the potential to be helpful. How can the United States better support regional counterterrorism and border control efforts?
Thank you very much. You know, we're really seeing the very beginning of some of these forms of multilateral cooperation, particularly, as you mentioned, the joint patrols are only a couple of weeks old. And one of the things the United States can do is continue to support the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities that would guide and support those patrols. And to continue to build, via assistance to the Philippines, its overall maritime capacity. My general sense of these patrols is that the capacity of the Philippine government in the Sulu Sea and around that in those southern waters is an area that particularly needs to be beefed up, and that is an area where the United States, along with other U.S. security partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, can be particularly helpful.
Great, thank you very much, Mr. Sanderson and Ms. Puri. As you know, many Indonesian officials have been educated in Saudi-funded schools. There are multiple strains of Salafi ideology, as I understand it. How does Salafi ideology express itself in Indonesia, and how influential is Wahhabism? Mr. Sanderson.
That's not an area of expertise of mine, but let me indicate from fieldwork that I've conducted in the region among all these countries, is that Indonesia in particular has a very large, moderate, mainstream Muslim community. They have large...
Are there moderate political and jihadi strains involved, or...?
Absolutely. I mean, in every country you would find those. Indonesia happens to be an excellent example of where you have very large communities that have rejected those more extreme, intolerant interpretations of Islam. Groups like Nahdlatul Ulama, Muhammadiyah, and other community groups have rejected that. You saw it in the response to the 2002 Bali bombing, where there was a rejection of JI's vicious attack that killed 202 people. So that works to our advantage in the region, but you do have the influence of more extreme forms of Islam that have come in from the Arabian Gulf that have been pushed through schools and through mosques. And that is of concern to us. But let me turn to my colleague for more details on that.
Thank you. I think the issue of Gulf state funding in general, non-Arab countries with Muslim majority populations, is an issue because when we look at the way various Muslim communities practice Islam, it varies greatly. And I can full well understand and respect the confusion it is when people are trying to understand that spectrum and try to create policy with that in mind. But to your question specifically, the foreign funding that comes into countries like Indonesia are not only spent necessarily to construct mosques or create Islamic schools, but they can go to civic organizations, like a women's club, to do anything that is not really on its face a religious issue. But in that coming together, the way they engage, what they talk about, usually is built on a foundation of a very, very traditional and fundamentalist way of life. And that is what's advocated through conversation and socializing and, for example, in Ramadan, the activities that you would have that bring communities together. I've had conversations that, take this with a grain of salt because it's anecdotal, but people don't want to talk about the fact that, for example, if the Indonesian government wants to push back on funding that they're not comfortable with, it's been alleged that the Saudi government will then come back and say, well, we won't give visas to Indonesians that want to come on pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia. Now, for practicing Muslims, like my mother even, like going on pilgrimage is a big deal. And so for a Muslim majority country government to do something that can be perceived in the public space as preventing Muslims from practicing their faith, the nuances of the issue won't be discussed. It'll become another point that extremists can grab onto and say this government is not allowing you to be a good Muslim.
Thank you. I appreciate Mr. Sanderson. There have been reports of Saudi Arabia collaborating with Indonesia on efforts to prevent radicalization. And King Salman visited Indonesia this spring. How effective do you think such de-radicalization programs are, and is there a role for the U.S. in promoting peaceful ideologies?
The government of Saudi Arabia does not have any interest in sponsoring groups or movements that would then target its own government, which they do. So what the government may do bilaterally, in this case, does not always reflect what happens at a different level among clergy, among wealthy individuals who want to fund more conservative ideologies, more conservative mosques, more conservative madrasas. So I applaud Saudi Arabia's effort to work with the Indonesian government. I think that is a good thing to do. But that is not the only channel of influence and money that comes from Saudi Arabia. A lot of that comes under the table or it comes privately. And I think that's important, and that's what we should focus on. I think the U.S. has a role certainly in promoting a range of voices and making sure that there are multiple sources of information and interpretations available to citizens of countries like Indonesia.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Sanderson. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the time.